Welcome to this anthropology lecture on stratified societies. This would be lecture 9. In the last lecture, we took a look at relatively egalitarian societies where equality is the norm in terms of people's access to different stations, jobs, or positions in society. The societies that we look at today are going to have very clear differences in who can get access to resources, who can get access to power, and then how that access is transmitted across generations. The word strata for stratified implies layers. So you should think of this as a society with layers in it, or societies, because I'm going to give you several examples. Then I'm going to end this lecture with some Egyptian mythology. Let's first talk a chiefdom. If you've had me for APUSH or maybe US, we've talked about chiefdoms before. These are fairly well integrated societies in which there's a clear leader. The societies we looked at in the last lecture, there could be a person who exercised some influence, but his influence is persuasive in nature. People look up to him, but it's not like he has any formal power in that society. In a chiefdom, though, the leader is very clearly defined. Some places might call him a king. In ancient Egypt, eventually we get to the name Pharaoh, but it's not yet a common idea as like a name for the king. But clearly it's a person with power, someone with the ability to command, to lead, who can bring together, integrate all the elements of society under his leadership. Many chiefdoms govern through redistribution. That is, their power consists very much in their ability to pull goods in and then send them back out to various members of that society. And the chief's control over redistribution is what sustains his prestige and his power. So, for example, in early American history, some of you might know that the chiefdom, the chief who met the English in Virginia, Powhatan, that chief had control over the copper trade in colonial Virginia, and he used his control over access to copper as a way of redistributing goods to favorites, to people that were loyal, to people who were supporting his power and his prestige in society. And in fact, his leadership was so successful and so widespread that anthropologists and historians call him a paramount chief. That is, he's a chief over other chiefs. So you might have a chief over one village and then a chief who oversees lots of other chiefs. And the way those systems work is usually through the redistribution of goods, often in a very ritualized fashion. That is, there is a ritual or a ceremony that goes along with the distribution of these goods, such that you get the goods at a particular time, at a particular setting. Maybe there are prayers, maybe there's a feast. Something is involved so that these goods flow through the society at specific points for specific reasons. We're going to see some elements of that in ancient Egypt, and particularly as we get closer and closer to the Egyptian state in Dynasty 1 and 2, these chiefdoms, these powerful leaders will control access to goods, and who gets those and how that is distributed is a sign of the favor of the leader, of the king. Chiefdoms can be at the village level. Um, they can unite villages, they can unite tribes, they can unite clans or family lineages together. Those of you who have APUSH experience might remember talking about different clans or families with a common ancestor. They trace back to usually an ancestor who is uh, almost mythological in nature, um, sometimes represented by an animal. So these lineages and tribes and villages can be united under a chiefdom. What we see economically in these cases where chiefdoms exist is that the people are agriculturalists. Um, Primarily, a lot of their caloric intake in society comes from growing crops. There is also trade, because trade is how you access prestige goods or goods that are highly valued, something like gold or ivory, things that are valued by the leaders, valued by people in power, and therefore there's a need to get those by trading for those resources. Status-wise, in chiefdoms, you definitely see a lot of inheritable status, particularly in the chief and his family, where the idea is the power flows through that chief into his sons, or however the power flows, because it's not always from father to son. Not every society works that way. And there's a clear sense that some families have more power and more wealth, and their ties to the chief enable them to have more access to power. Maybe their ties through marriage, maybe their ties through just their physical proximity to the chief, as trusted advisors or leaders or military sort of personnel. But it's a clear sense in which those people who have power expect to pass it on. It doesn't die with you, it goes to your children, and particularly to your sons, because in most places in the ancient world, there's going to be a lot of male dominance. Not always, but a lot. In terms of law in a chiefdom, typically the chief has some limited power to punish or maintain order. And usually there's like an appeal to the chief to say, what do we do in this situation? But the chief often governs by custom or tradition. So that power is limited. The chief can't just simply go, you know what, off with his head, I don't care, kill him. There is some sense in which the chief has to make a decision that is in accordance to what is customary and what has always been done. Um, the loyalty to that chief, because of his control over goods, often inspires obedience. So if you want to be rewarded in this prestige good system where it's redistributed goods, you need to display a certain amount of loyalty, and sometimes even reciprocity, where you might reciprocate the gift with a gift of your own, even if your own gift is a mere token. Sometimes it's just the ritual of exchanging the gift that cements the relationship and says, I've given you something, you give me something, even though the two gifts are not equal. Still, we're bound, we're tied together. Very often, that inspires loyalty, which inspires obedience in chief-based societies or chiefdoms. Finally, property in a chiefdom, there's a sense of individual ownership, particularly of ordinary goods. This is my comb. This is my bowl. This is my pot. Um, Typically, the clans or the family lineages own land. So this land is controlled by this particular family, the house of such and such. Um, the chief also controls territory, and as a group collectively, the chiefdom knows what its territory is. Um, the borders are not necessarily well defined. There's just a sense that our property extends to this area over here. This has traditionally belonged to us, the people of, whatever. Um, but there's no sense in which that's marked off or fenced off for the most part. It's once again custom, and tradition holds a lot of weight to say this is where our people live and what we own and what we control as a people. So those are 4 of the characteristics of a chiefdom. You can see that it's much more centralized, much more highly organized than those egalitarian bands or egalitarian tribes that we've studied. This is a more complex form of political organization. We saw quite a bit of that heading in that direction in pre-dynastic Egypt. Here's a supposed head of Narmer found by Petrie, though there's no catfish chisel on it to tell us that. But clearly somebody was important enough to get their head carved in stone. I mean, you don't have Joe Schmo get a carving. People who are important get to be able to use social resources and economic resources and physical resources to make a statement about who they are. And we begin to see in pre-dynastic Egypt, that is before Narmer, evidence of this increasing organization towards chiefdoms and eventually a state. Your reading on the Quata 1 through 3 mentioned that there's increasing social stratification in burials. Elite goods and tomb size mark social difference. Some tombs are just bigger. Tomb 100 has a tomb painting, whereas Joe Schmo is just curled up in the fetal position with a mat over him and maybe a pot or two in a little oval grave. But somebody else over here in the Quata culture has a very large underground tomb built of mud brick. It took time to build. It's full of things that indicate that that person was important. They mattered in society and they had power. We also start to see what we call specialization of economic roles in society, where certain members of this society become makers of finished goods. You can spend your time making pots or carving pallets to grind cosmetics on. You can spend your time making mace heads. All those goods that we've seen in the readings thus far that remind us that some people can be taken out of agriculture long enough to make products. And you start to see this in these societies of chiefdoms and early states. There's evidence of extensive trade. Trade indicates, that not only are people moving, but they have both the power and the resources to move and engage in trade with other people. To trade, you have to have something to trade with. And you just can't go to another society and go, see, I got this little cap and I want to get some gold for it. That's not going to work. You need to have something that encourages other people to trade with you so that you can come back with the gold and the resources that are indicative of your status. And we see that in Quata 1 through 3. where there's trade with Nubia to the south of Egypt, trade with Palestine. You remember the tomb that was full of jars and jars of what we think was wine. These goods indicate that there's enough power to go and get cool objects from faraway places. And those cool objects get buried with one guy because he is the most powerful guy or a wealthy guy, a guy with status. We start to see regional chiefdoms appear just before unification. Some people kind of think of these as like proto-states. The terminology is slippery because, as organization and societies get more complicated and more complex and things get bigger and bigger, at what point do you call it a state? What point is it still just like a chiefdom of sorts? And what the heck's going on with my hair? I have no idea. These areas around Abydos and Naquata, Hierakonpolis in the south, or Nekhen, start to appear, and then they get absorbed into each other, and we get a southern Egypt that eventually ends up uniting with a northern Egypt. So the territory and the power within that territory is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. We're getting bigger political units over time. One of the things that I'd like to take a sort of little break to talk about, and you don't see this as much in anthropology textbooks, at least introductory cultural anthropology, as I think you probably should, is that many early chiefdoms and states or proto-states develop ways of legitimating or making their power seem natural and normal as part of the power that they have. The power of chiefs is often reinforced through symbols, iconography or images that reflect the fact that this chief has power, and this image represents the power of that chief. Think about our own culture and society. What images represent power? Badges for police officers, the seal of the President of the United States, flags, for example. And very often, too, in these early societies, religion reinforces that iconography. So not only does this chief have power, and this image represents it, but dude, don't mess with this guy because he speaks for the gods, and the gods have his back. These names of chiefs, what we call them, Pharaoh, Werowance, Kaiser, whatever you want to call this leader, that the names and the images reinforce his separation from ordinary people. We have to create this sense in which this person has power. It's a legitimate use of power, and dude, he's not like us. So chiefdoms develop this, especially in early Egypt, but we see it in lots of other places where states are forming. These ideologies of power create a story that says this chief has a legitimate right to rule, a legitimate claim to the throne. Don't mess with this guy, because this is the gods speaking here, and they back him. I just want to give you an example from early Egypt. An early Egyptian king, leader, chief that we haven't talked about, named Double Falcon. What a name, right? Somewhere around 3200 BCE, Double Falcon's name was found above a sarek. A sarek is a symbol that's sort of like a rectangle or a square that represents the palace. So it's an image that is directly connected to the building in which the king lives. And what a potent image for power in early Egypt and many early societies in general. The building becomes a stand-in for the person who is in control. And so we see this Sarek appear quite often in early Egypt in the early dynasties. And on top of it will be an image of the god Horus. So that's a religious connection. A falcon will be on top. And then somewhere in the top of it will be the name of the ruler. We're not actually sure of Double Falcon's real name, because in the place where there should be a name for him, it's not really clear that there's a name there. Various Egyptologists have read different things into it to suggest different possibilities for an actual name, but we're just not sure. What we are sure is that having two falcons on top of your Sarek is pretty unique. Are you double Horus, if that's the case? Is Horus twice behind you? That's pretty potent imagery. I think even more potent is the fact that we found this image of the double falcon in the Delta, so close to the Mediterranean, ancient Israel, before there was an ancient Israel, in the Sinai Peninsula, as well as upper or southern Egypt. So his name being everywhere is evidence of his reach. So finally, you've been waiting for it. That's double falcon. You can see the two birds on the top. I know the birds don't look impressive. They look like sort of like partridges sitting on like a Cracker Jack box, eating the popcorn out of it. But that's actually Horus twice, the falcon-headed god Horus. And this lined area here is a representation of the king's palace. So think about that imagery and how that imagery sells double falcon's power. Look at me, double falcon, twice the god Horus on my side, the image of the palace, which you poor peasant guy can't have because you're poor and I'm the king. That kind of imagery legitimates power, and we just even stop thinking about it after a while because it's so omnipresent in society. So by the time of Narmer, but really probably in his successor Horaha, Egypt is approaching what is called a state society. It's a highly politically organized society with a central power, so just like a chiefdom. But there's a more structured hierarchy in this society, and a government that has a monopoly of force. Force can be exercised, violence can be exercised through the government. State societies are just kind of more complex chiefdoms. Intensive agriculture, trade, still there, markets for goods, so there's buying and selling of goods, and there's a way that that's controlled or regulated. Note, this is a really important differentiation here. States rely on taxation. That is, you owe the state some form of payment. This is kind of a step up from redistribution, whereas redistribution is often ritualized, and there's the giving of gifts in order to cement loyalty and obedience. Taxation is a more formal process, but it is still kind of like that. You give to the state gives back in the form of protecting you from violence or making sure the markets work. There's often a bureaucracy created because state societies are so big and so complex. You need a way to manage the taxation. You need a way to manage trade. The king cannot handle everything. And the king plus an advisor can't handle everything. The king plus 5 advisors can't handle everything. In a state as big as ancient Egypt, you need lots and lots of people to handle all the various jobs to make the state function. And as we saw heading into the unification of Egypt, writing is needed for the record keeping of the state. So we see writing to illustrate names in those sureks. We see writing used to mark goods in graves to say this is the good from this particular place in Egypt. That's what states need writing for. Ordinary people don't need it. Like, I'll sell you this mug. Well, fine. I'll trade you the mug for this ring. Okay, good. We don't need record keeping for that. We don't need writing for that. But the state does. There's a very clear set of social classes. Once again, layers in society. There are certain people on top and certain people on the bottom. It's very clear how you get there, and it's often very difficult to get out of that. There is private ownership of land, but the state also owns land, and the state has a very clear way of controlling the land that it owns and taking land from private hands if it needs to or wants to. Definitely formal laws in a state society. There is a sense in which law is written down in some way. It might still be customary, but the decisions that are made are in accordance with, some set of prescribed principles. This is what we do when this happens. The state controls the use of force, so you can't just go around executing people at will. The state has to tell you, okay, yes, you can chop his head off. Yes, he needs to be punished. And the state controls a defined territory. More so than in chiefdoms, the states recognize borders. And we'll see this in early Egypt with the establishment of forts to clearly say, this is the border. We control this. Don't cross this line. This is where, once you're over on this side, you're in the wrong territory, buddy. Finally, I want to end with a story. It's such an interesting Egyptian myth with a lot of Egyptological sources for it. Some of the sources are very old. Some of the sources are from late Egypt. Some of the sources are even Roman retellings of these stories. So there's not really a definitive version that has every element in it. But I like this story because I think it illustrates some things that are very interesting about early Egypt. And the story is the contendings of Horus and Set. Our story begins with Osiris, Egypt's first king after the sun god and the creator god. Osiris rules with Isis, his wife, as the queen of Egypt, and all is good, and they're upholding Ma'at, order and rightness in the universe. But there's a problem brewing, and that's Osiris's brother, Set, or Seth. Set grew jealous. Why can't I be king? It's not fair. Why does Osiris get everything? So he murdered his brother. Lots of different versions of how this happened. Some he's put in a coffin and sealed up and thrown in a river, and some he's attacked by Set as an animal. In one later version, he is Set chops Osiris into 42 pieces. Pretty gruesome way to go. So the king has been murdered. There's been an attack on the king. And what happens? Well, the queen steps in. So never underestimate the power of the queen, Isis. Isis finds Osiris's body and she restores it. She puts him back together and she does some magic enough that she can get pregnant from her dead husband. Yeah, just think about that. Um, be that as it may, this pregnancy results in the birth of Horus, the falcon-headed god, who is the rightful king. And you can see in this image here, there is Horus and there is Set. Set's always depicted as this weird animal that kind of looks like if a jackal mated with an anteater and then grew a set of weird horns on its head. Set's the personification of disorder, chaos, everything that's wrong with the world. So clearly it's not a real animal. So here's the rightful king, Horus, flying high over the Egyptian landscape. But Set is on the throne, so Horus is going to have to grow up and fight. So Isis takes Horus to a thicket near the delta and raises him, and this gives rise to a whole lot of Egyptian traditions and customs having to do with being raised and hidden from the evil of Set, so that Set can't kill his baby rival. So Horus manages to grow up to adulthood, become a man, and he starts fighting Set, and it takes a long time, years and years and years, and they go through a number of fights and conflicts. Probably the weirdest is at one point Set attempts to rape Horus and impregnate him. Horus, in revenge, puts his semen on lettuce, which then Set eats and gets impregnated. So there's a whole lot of stuff about who's the real man here and who's gotten pregnant with the other. And eventually the gods are just tired of this. They just want to put an end to this, and they decide that Horus is the rightful ruler. And that's why in ancient Egypt, the king is associated with Horus. He identifies with Horus, the falcon-headed god, and in death, the king identifies with Osiris. So think about this myth and what it says about ancient Egypt and the nature of kingship and the nature of power and religion reinforcing that. Take care.